Okay, before we get started with the sixth lesson, I just wanted to do a quick review of how to add and subtract fractions for those of us who have forgotten. When I add fractions or subtract them, I need to have a common denominator. So when I look at my two fractions in my first example, 3/4 plus 1/6, I have two different denominators. Now I want to come up with the lowest common denominator between them. So one trick that you can do to find a common denominator is just multiply. So a common denominator is just taking the 4 and the 6, the two original denominators, and multiplying them. So 24 is a common denominator, but it's bigger than we need to make it. The lowest common denominator is the first number that I can multiply both 4 to and 6 to. So when I'm thinking about all the multiples of 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, and I'm thinking about all the multiples of 6, 12, 18, 24, I notice that they both have 12 in common in both of those lists. So the lowest common denominator is actually 12. This doesn't seem like a huge deal when you're talking about adding two fractions because you know you can just reduce to lowest terms later. But when you're starting to think about algebra, the bigger that you make the algebra, the harder it is to reduce. So if we can find a lowest common denominator, we always want to do that. Now to create a lowest common denominator, I'm going to change both of these denominators to 12s. I've already decided that that is going to be my lowest common denominator. I have to decide what did I do to the 4 to change it into a 12. And when I'm changing, I'm always thinking about using multiplication to do that. It's the only way for me to change fractions, multiplication or dividing. So 4 times 3 would give me the 12. And if I multiply the bottom by 3, I need to multiply the numerator by 3 as well. So in the top, I get a 9. And then moving to the second fraction, I had a 6. I want to change it to a 12. So I need to take the 6 and multiply it by 2. But if I multiply the denominator by 2, I need to multiply the numerator by 2. And so on the top, I get 2. Now that I have a common denominator, my denominator does not change. It is still 12, and I just add the numerators together. And so I get 11/12. That's my final answer. There's nothing I can do to reduce that. Moving over to the second example, 2/7 minus 3/5. Again, I could come up with a common denominator. So I'm thinking about my common denominator. One trick that's always going to work is just take the two denominators and multiply them together, and I get 35. And now if I go through all of the multiples of 7, so 7, 14, 21, and then I go through all the multiples of 5, 10, 15, the first one that they have in common is actually 35. So in this case, the common denominator is actually the lowest common denominator. So I'm going to create two new fractions. They're going to be equivalent fractions because they're going to be the same, but these guys are going to have the common denominator of 35. So I go back and I ask myself, how did I change the 7 to a 35? I had to multiply it by 5, which tells me I need to multiply the numerator by 5 as well. And then looking at the second fraction, to change the 5 to 35, I need to multiply by 7. So I need to multiply the numerator by 7 as well. And I get 21. Again, I've created the common denominator, so don't change it, leave it. It's 35. I had 10 35ths, and I'm taking away 21 35ths. So that gives me negative 11, 10 minus 21. And that would be done.